All right, today we've got Chris Rufo, the author of America's Cultural Revolution. I just want to start by saying congratulations on your incredible success, Chris. You've got a #1 Amazon bestseller. Amazing. Right, and I also want to thank you for making life better for me, and especially for younger scholars who don't have tenure. There was someone who was really mad at me who said, Brian, you're carrying water for Chris Rufo. And my reply is, no, Chris carries water for me every day. Every day, Chris is actually getting his hands dirty, trying to keep universities from being the hellscape that a lot of people want them to be. So thanks a lot, Chris. You do so much.
My pleasure. I'm here to serve.
All right. Let's just start with the book. All right, America's Cultural Revolution. Just to start off, there's an obvious historical reference here. So are you thinking of this as America's version of the literal Chinese Cultural Revolution, or do you have something else in mind?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's the reference, that's the illusion, but it's not that it's just me imposing that frame on what's been happening in elite institutions since the late 1960s. Actually, the new left philosophers and activists of the era in 1968, 1969, they themselves said that what they were pursuing was a cultural revolution, modeled in part on what was happening in communist China. They called their key tactic in the 1970s the long march through the institutions, another reference to what was happening in communist China. And so this is not, and some of my critics on the left have said, oh, it's not a cultural revolution because people aren't getting dragged out and killed in the streets like they were in China, therefore your book is false. It's like, well, if you had done the homework and read, you would find that actually they had developed this theory, Herbert Marcuse and his students and other activists at the time, of cultural revolution that would precede the larger revolution. And so I just plucked it from their own references and used it in the title of the book.
All right. Right now, you organized this book, which I consider surprisingly academic, around 4 intellectual superstars. So we've got Herbert Marcuse, Angela Davis, Paulo Freire, and Derek Bell. Now, is this because you think these individuals dramatically changed our intellectual culture, or were they just ambassadors for ideas that already had broad appeal?
Some combination of both. I don't think that they were causal agents that changed the course of history because of their kind of unique spiritual capacities. I think that would be overestimating the case. But I do think that they were able to rationalize, to synthesize, and then to spread the ideas that drove these movements. And they're in a sense symbolic of the larger patterns of intellectual change, of institutional change. And I think they also can anchor the stories and anchor the narrative that I'm telling in rich biographical detail. So you actually understand these are real flesh and blood people that are advancing this political project. It's not merely a Hegelian dialectic that proceeds without any human cause at all.
So if they hadn't been born, was there a close substitute waiting in the wings for each of these, or maybe it would have actually mattered?
Sure. I mean, I think Marcuse is probably one that was the most unique, but certainly there were alternatives to Angela Davis. There was Eldridge Cleaver, there was H. Rap Brown, there was other leaders of the Communist Party USA. Paulo Freire, probably also some substitutions. And even in the selection of these 4 personalities, well, why these and not others? To me, they represented just in such a tight and really one-to-one way the progression of ideologies through institutions, the influence and the lineage of many of the concepts that we think of today as kind of part of BLM or part of DEI or part of kind of radical left ideology more generally. And so I kind of don't get too hung up on some of the kind of social science style questions, because what I'm really trying to do at the heart of this is tell a story, to bring together a narrative that has an argument that's implicit, baked into the narrative, rather than trying to demonstrate a kind of logical or mathematical proof.
Now, for Ray, he's the 3rd most cited academic in all of social science. I'm not sure I've even heard of him before reading your book. I mean, it seems hard to believe that guy would have gotten replaced with someone who'd been as successful, doesn't it?
Yeah, he's a unique figure, and I think he's kind of a hidden ruler of American intellectual life. I mean, he's two spots behind Foucault. I think everyone at this point knows Foucault, at least the very basics of his life and ideas. Paulo Freire is somewhat unknown, and yet he is remarkably influential, and really the top #1 most profound influence on graduate schools of education relative to any other educational theorist. And so his ideas are quite important for a modern American life. And then his biography is just stunning because he led a life of a peripatetic, third world, revolutionary propagandist. And yet somehow, despite his ideas failing everywhere he tried to implement them in the third world revolutionary societies, he's been pulled as a key influence in the American educational system. And so I think it's just such a unique symbol of idiocy of the American intellectual class that they would take someone with such an abysmal track record and elevate him into an American hero.
All right, now 3 of the 4 superstars you cover, so Marcuse, Davis, and Freire, were actual communists. Your book seems to assume that readers will know why communism is awful. Just in case your readers don't know that, Chris, why is communism awful?
Well, I think, I assume a little bit of background knowledge on behalf of the reader, but I mean, if you look at the historical record of communist societies in the 20th century, I mean, it is a long and brutal sequence of failure, starvation, repression, tyranny, blood, executions, gulags, and the total stifling of all of the great kind of arts and culture and civil society that is the mark of high culture. And so, there's really no positive legacy from 20th century communism. I think the New York Times tries to say that communist women were sexually, I mean, I don't know. There's some crackpot theories that try to put a kind of silver lining into the communist experience, but anyone who lived through communism in the 20th century, if you talk to them, you can get a real visceral understanding of how brutal and inhuman those kinds of regimes have been.
I mean, what's really striking to me is that when I do talk to people who lived under communism, normally they don't know the bad stuff that well either. Often you say, well, like, what about mass famine? Like, what? So, like, I grew up in Los Angeles in Reagan country in the 80s, and probably the worst thing we ever heard about communism was the Berlin Wall. The idea, look, the Berlin Wall, that's what the West gets to see. That's where we can photograph stuff. That's where the stuff is as good as it gets. That idea really was just never taught.
Wow. I mean, that's something that's quite shocking and really a huge failure on behalf of the educational system. Yeah. And I think something that some conservative states and legislators are trying to rectify. I know that Governor DeSantis in Florida had a kind of victims of communism day, trying to get some of those narratives and some of those facts into the curriculum of their K-12 schools, really helped by the fact that there are so many kind of right-wing Cubans in the state of Florida. They certainly have not forgotten the atrocities of communism. But yeah, I mean, it really is this kind of this hidden history. I mean, the communist world of the 20th century was just a nightmare, and very few Americans know about it in any detail. And certainly after the end of the Cold War, it's something that evaporated from the minds even of very anti-communist, anti-red conservatives. We thought that the war was won, communism was discredited forever, and we could just retreat into private and economic life and live the kind of materialist Reaganist utopia that was awaiting us. But that, of course, was very far from the truth.
Now, are you fully on board with the moral equivalence of communism and Nazism?
I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about it. What's the argument? What's the best argument to make that equivalence?
Two totalitarian systems with similar body counts.
You're saying in moral terms, are they morally equivalent and evil? Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, these are complex questions. You could tease out all the details, but in broad strokes, I do think that, and you know, given that Nazism was you know, very fortunately defeated in World War II, you could say even that the Soviet Union that practiced communism for longer, the Chinese communists that practiced communism for longer, even in, you know, Latin America and Africa, the communist historical experience was much longer, and therefore had an even more ample opportunity to do damage to people. Yeah, I think that, I guess lefties, yeah, still argue that communism was somehow just a naive idea that somehow went wrong, rather than there was evil baked into it from the beginning, which is more in line with what I believe.
Yeah, or you could also just think of it in terms of the stigma of inviting a communist to your party versus a Nazi to your party.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, and the kind of
social
public
party, not a
perception,
political
you know,
party.
yeah, you could be, yeah, you could invite your good old commie to your party, and it'd be a cool thing. So, you know.
All right, so you start the book with Herbert Marcuse, who positioned himself as an opponent of both Soviet Marxism and American imperialism. If you think of these as two poles on a continuum, where would Marcuse have even placed himself, or where should he have placed himself?
I think that he would probably, in the modern rubric, if you have that political quadrant, he would identify himself with the libertarian left, and meaning that he was part of the left in terms of economics, wanting to be liberated from the system of capitalism, but he was also a libertarian on some of these social principles. He believed that we should be liberated from conservative sexual habits, manners, mores, and traditions, that we should be liberated from any kind of repression of our desires.
So sort of like Eric Fromm, right? Another person in the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, that's right. I think that kind of broadly speaking, I would position him in the libertarian left.
But at the same time, it didn't seem like he had a problem with the extreme social repression of Cuba or China or any of the revolutionary communist movements. It seems like he basically was angry about the traditional Soviet bloc economies that have been communist for quite a while, but he was very forgiving of whatever would be happening under Mao, for example.
Yeah, and this is one of the fatal flaws in his flaw. I mean, Marcuse was a brilliant man, a meticulous scholar. You know, certainly no one would argue that he was intellectually incapable of understanding the situation, but he was deeply naive. And although he correctly labeled the Soviet Union a bureaucratic tyranny, he continuously fell prey to this naive notion that somehow it would be better in these other places. You know, he had romantic notions about Mao, romantic notions about other revolutionaries, romantic notions about the third world guerrilla fighters, and then even romantic notions about the violent revolutionaries in the West. And then, you know, in his correspondence and some of the contemporaneous coverage about him at the time, he's almost surprised when many of his students are starting to plant bombs in American institutions, are starting to, you know, work on campaigns to delegitimize and then, you know, assassinate police officers, and really wreaking havoc on American society. And he's somewhat shocked that it could turn out this way. And so I think a brilliant man, but also a naive man who could not see some of those hidden dangers in his own ideas.
Did he ever visit China during the Cultural Revolution?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that would have come up. You know, I think that
he didn't go to Hanoi. We don't have like Hanoi Herbert.
No, but he did participate in a summit with the North Vietnamese delegation in Berlin and in other parts of Europe. He was mobilizing kind of in support of some of those movements and some of those struggles. And so, but his travels were really, you know, quite interesting. He traveled a lot late in life as he became this historical figure, the prophet of the New Left. But it was mostly restricted to American cities and then European cities. He felt most comfortable in those cities of the West. And maybe had he traveled to China or Cuba or Vietnam, he might have seen the error in his ways. You know, one can only speculate.
Yeah, I mean, I've long been very puzzled by especially the West German Marxists, where Marcuse would fit very well in there, coming from Frankfurt. So it's like, seriously, why don't you just move east? You don't even have to learn a new language. So like, what do you think Marcuse would have said to like, why don't you just move over to East Germany?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that his actions answer that question more accurately than his words.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, yeah, we know that he
yeah,
didn't want to because he didn't, but what would he even have said to that? I mean, I've thought about this, I think, there's this great movie, The Baader-Meinhof Complex, about the Baader-Meinhof gang, and it starts where they're all in West Berlin, and it's like, look, you can walk to the better country if you think it's so much better, so why don't you?
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because the Baader-Meinhof founders were avid, students of Marcuse. They had read and internalized his work, and then they had mutual connections through people like Rudi Dutschke. But I think that they would probably rationalize it as, we are bringing the revolution to the West. We are the tip of the spear by bringing communism to West Germany, to Europe. We are activists at the forefront of this fight to get beyond the wall and into the heart of Europe. I imagine that that's how they would have perhaps rationalized it.
It's almost like they're saying, oh, well, that would be very selfish of me to go and just get paradise for myself right now, or if not paradise, just a big improvement. And it's like, well, yeah, but you could also be a prophet leading people to the promised land. If it's so great, be Brigham Young, lead people out to Utah.
Yeah, and it's like that old trope about the wall. It's like, well, is the wall keeping people out of East Germany, or is the wall keeping people from leaving East Germany? And then which society is better based on the market mechanism of which way people are trying to go and which way you have to forcibly stop them from traveling. And so, look, I mean, it kind of, in retrospect, it's shocking how naive some of these figures were. And then it's even more shocking that they never gave up. I mean, they really never gave up their ideology. Even someone like Paulo Freire, into the 70s, into the 1980s, he was still defending the Cultural Revolution in China. He was still defending Chairman Mao. He still said that the Cultural Revolution in China was, quote, the most genial solution of the century. I mean, if it's, you kind of have trouble parsing it. Is this person just totally delusional and disconnected from reality? Or does this person have a kernel of such inhumanity that they're willing to rationalize mass death and destruction because it serves an ideological purpose?
All right. So continuing Marcuse, all right, there's a very common story that Western Marxists like Marcuse oppose the Soviet bloc in the name of democratic socialism. But given their very strong support for new revolutionary socialist dictatorships, couldn't you just say the real complaint about the Soviet bloc in the 60s was that it was boring?
I think there is part of that, perhaps true, but I would actually give Marcuse a bit more credit, and I would be a bit more charitable, because he did write a book in I believe 1955 called Soviet Marxism.
Right. And
it was a really brutal critique. I don't think that he was carrying water for the Soviets in any way. And I think that he genuinely believed that it was a failed experiment in the Soviet Union, but one that could be improved upon in other societies. So I don't think that he was a cynic. And actually, that's something that I came to admire in all the time I spent studying Marcuse and his letters, his writings, his correspondence, his journal entries and such, is that there's a kernel of authentic idealism even into his kind of elderly period, that I found somewhat touching and somewhat inspiring in this kind of wrapped in a very ironic and very horrible analysis, right? The actual facts that emerge from it are quite horrifying and quite revolting. But there's a core, there's kind of a pureness to him that even all these years later is at the very least fascinating and compelling.
So I haven't read Soviet Marxism. I mean, would his position, or did he ever actually say the Soviet Union is worse than the West, or was that a bridge too far for him?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Marcuse, the caricature of Marcuse is that he is a kind of enemy of the West. He seeks to undermine Western society. He's against Western culture. I actually don't think that that's true at all. Actually, Marcuse was a great admirer of Western culture. He was a great appreciator of Western philosophy. He was a great student of the great works of the Western tradition. And he was a great kind of proponent of high culture, high culture as far as classical music, literature, language, etc. And he was even at a time in his life very grateful to the United States. He describes in interviews coming to fleeing the Nazis. I mean, very compelling story, fleeing the Nazis, and seeing and having the ship that he was on pass by the Statue of Liberty, and in a sense he's counting his blessings, really grateful for the country. He actually served the United States as kind of an intelligence officer, processing intelligence, processing intellectual materials
like
for
a
the
lot of
OSS
communists
of the
did,
time.
right? Strangely, they were really eager to volunteer for these kinds of jobs.
Yeah, but I don't approach it cynically, because by all the historical record that we have, he actually truly did believe in the country, and in his own writings, he said that his opinions turned sour following World War II. And so I don't think that he was this, sleeper agent sent to destroy the United States. I mean, I think that stuff is more kind of caricature and one-dimensional than the truth, which is that he had a complex relationship with the West. He had complex relationship with the United States, and then a complex relationship with the revolutionary movements of the Third World.
But again, did he ever actually write a sentence saying the United States is better than the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union is worse than the United States? Did he ever actually open his mouth and say that sentence in his whole career?
I can't say definitively, because I don't have the exact quotations in front of me. I don't remember him saying anything that direct, but I do wonder if you pressed him on it, maybe in say 1976, 1977, would he say that? I think if you pressed him on it, he might concede. Yeah, in a direct comparison between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
I mean, you do
maybe not.
I mean, some quotes from about like our new left revolution has failed. But again, it never seems to be failure in the sense of we discovered that our proposed reforms are bad. It's always failure in the sense of we didn't win yet, which yes, I would say is a world of difference. It's really not a big concession for a communist revolutionary to say, oh man, we went and lost in Greece. It's like, that's very different from saying we lost in the Soviet Union, where you're basically saying that once you had power, it was a disaster. Very unlike saying there was a fight and we got clobbered. Two totally different stories, and one is still consistent with the ideas are great, and the other one is really not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, yeah. He never quite learned. He never quite was able to absorb the experience that was common knowledge at that time. There's no excuse in the late 1970s not to know about the Cultural Revolution in China. I mean, there really is no excuse. There was too much information available. So if any educated person, especially someone that has a deep interest in politics and Marxist politics in particular, it really is a shame. And it's the same with all these folks. I mean, with Marcuse, with Angela Davis, with Paulo Freire, even with Derek Bell. I mean, that really is, in a sense, their fatal flaw. They're unable to assimilate the consequences of their own ideas because it's too painful. They simply choose to deny or to rationalize or to explain away.
All right. Now, I think I know what you're going to say for this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just to remove all doubt. All right. A common complaint about Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, and really continental philosophy in general, is that it's just intellectually fraudulent. So it's meaningless verbiage. There's no real argument, no actual evidence. So on a 0 to 10 scale, how much do you agree with this?
Yeah, I don't know about a 0 to 10 scale, but I don't agree. I think that is a convenient fiction that is deployed by, let's say, right-wing commentators, analysts, writers to just dismiss the opponent's argument as frivolous, as based in nothing, as grounded in nothing but kind of false impulses. Look, I mean, I think their arguments are dead wrong. But if you actually read the work, look, they're not just a kind of fantasy fiction. They're making substantive arguments. They're grounding it in philosophical work in the case of Marcuse, and then even someone like Angela Davis. I think conservatives dismissed Angela Davis as a marginal figure, as a nobody, as someone of no intellectual capacity. It's a huge mistake. I think underestimating your enemies is just such a catastrophic intellectual as well as strategic mistake. And so as I'm reading these four figures, I identify limitations. I certainly don't agree with their arguments. I try to outline the conclusions, or rather the results of their ideas in the real world, which are kind of uniformly disastrous. But to me, it's just a smug and self-serving position to just kind of wave away their arguments with your hand. I don't think that's a good way to do it.
I mean, here's the way that I think about it. The very idea of an argument is you've got to start with a premise that would be plausible to someone that doesn't already agree with you, and then from there reason them to a conclusion that they don't currently hold, they don't initially hold, but you hold. That's the kind of thing that I pretty much never see in continental philosophy. There's more of a sense of we all have a general body of agreement here, and then we're going to reason from it. And to me, that's just not real arguments. Real arguments really, it has to begin by being addressed to someone that isn't convinced of your conclusions. You have to find some common ground and then reason from it. And that's what I don't see Marcuse doing. Can you think of what would be the best example of Marcuse actually trying to find some common ground with someone who is outside of his own intellectual tradition and then reason them into his conclusions?
But I guess the question though is why is that? I mean, why is that? Is that a historical norm? Why is that necessary? Is it a universal law of argumentation? I'm not. I mean, I could be convinced. I haven't thought about it in great detail, but I'm not sure that it's self-evident that that's how you have to make political arguments. I mean, political arguments have been made many other ways in the past.
I know.
Successfully, yeah.
Well, they're successfully in terms of winning adherence, but in terms of intellectual value, I mean, I would actually say that's really the fundamental idea of argumentation, is that you got to find a premise that is common ground between you and someone that does not already agree with your conclusions, and then reason them into a conclusion they don't currently have, or else it's really just circular. I mean, do you think that, does Marcuse ever really do that? Does he ever say, all right, I understand all you non-Marxists and you have these disagreements, but let's go and find some common ground, and then let me reason you into something that you don't currently.
No, quite the opposite. I mean, Marcuse openly advocated for the suppression of competing ideas. Yeah. And towards the end of his life, a journalist asked him, Professor Marcuse, are you saying that conservative, I mean, as at George Mason, you'll appreciate this, that conservative economists in universities who advocate for welfare reform, for trade agreements, for conservative policies on economics, should they be suppressed and excluded from academic institutions? And he doesn't even hesitate. He says, yes, in my ideal system, conservative academics who advocate against the welfare state should be suppressed. So right. he has a totalitarian streak to him. And so in a pure intellectual sense, yes, I think his arguments are vulnerable to the critique that you. But
isn't it just a pile of preaching to the choir?
Yeah, but I'm again I'm not necessarily convinced that is necessarily bad. I mean, certainly if you're preaching something evil and the choir is loving what you're saying and inspired to do something bad, obviously, but I actually think that this is a critical question, where a lot of conservatives I know believe and then act as if politics is an Oxford-style debate, and that there are two arguments, there's a moderator, there's an exchange of views, people get to rationally consider the alternatives and then vote to select their favored argument. And while I would love for politics to actually function that way, it doesn't function that way at all. Politics is a competition that operates on very different set of rules and principles. And as much as I would like it to be a process of reasoning together towards truth, I actually think that is quite rare in real life politics. And real life politics,
sure,
and you could even
I mean, then you might say, look, maybe there's a division of labor, so maybe there are popularizers who don't need to come up with arguments to persuade people who don't already agree with them. But when you're at the highest level of thought, you think that those are the people who do have the job of coming up with an argument that would be persuasive to someone that isn't already on your side. And isn't that one of the great failings of Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, and continental philosophy in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe, but I actually think there's a deeper problem in their thinking. And in Marcuse's case, we'll focus on that. Angela Davis, it's the same problem. I mean, if their ideas were right, if their view of human nature was accurate, if their political praxis yielded the results that they desired, it would be great. And in a sense, they would be perhaps even justified in the arguments that they were making. The deeper problem is that their ideas were wrong. Their ideas yielded unintended consequences that were, in many cases, the opposite of what they had hoped for. And so, yes, maybe their method of argumentation, again, it's not my method. I believe in persuasion. I love rational debate. I never turn down a debate. I enjoy it very much. But I think that there's something actually just a deep flaw in the logic of their own system. And I think that perhaps that's why they had to use force, or that's why they had to resort to extra parliamentary tactics, because they knew, I mean, they say this very explicitly, we will not be able to get a democratic majority through democratic means. Therefore, we have to use, at first they said kind of violent revolutionary methods. Then when that failed, they said, we need to march through the institutions and impose our ideology administratively without the consent of the governed. And so as a small L liberal or a small D Democrat, I mean, that's anathema to me, saying, hey, wait a minute, you're going to deliberately subvert the democratic process, the constitutional protections, and the system that we have built and that we have come into a social compact to support. They're playing with a very dangerous tactic, a very dangerous strategy. And so, yeah, I mean, in that sense, obviously that is not a kind of rational persuasion. That is not reason. But then what that requires from us is to actually deal with the problem as it exists, and knowing that we aren't having kind of the honest interlocutor that wants to sit on the debate stage and concede or gain territory according to the process of deliberation. And that's why I think what's happening right now in the political debate in Florida and elsewhere is so important, because what we're talking about is both. Are these ideas true or false, good or bad, beautiful or ugly? But also, what are the implications for these ideas and their rampage through our institutions as a political matter? What methods do we have to use to confront them?
All right. So I kept thinking about Orwell when I was reading your book. So you got tolerance is intolerance, colorblindness is racism, brainwashing is education. Is it just me, or did you have Orwell in mind too?
I didn't have Orwell in mind, but certainly some of those pairs are absolutely true. And I tried to tell the story as charitably and even-handedly as possible, while of course having my own opinion, my own argument, my own framing. But I really tried to stack up the evidence, stack up the reporting, stack up some of the historical research. That I think if a reader gives it a fair read, will drive the reader towards an inexorable conclusion, that these ideas yield their opposites. And that's something that was at the forefront of my mind. Maybe not Orwell per se, individually, but certainly this idea of idealism and then cynicism, this idea of revolution and disaster, this idea of liberation and slavery in a metaphorical sense, was something that I found to be the consistent pattern through all of these writings and all of these historical narratives.
All right. All right. So it's pretty obvious why BLM opposes colorblind equality today, because discrimination against Blacks was banned over 50 years ago, but Black-white gaps in income, educational success, and crime are still big. What's really striking to me is that Black radicals like Angela Davis opposed colorblind equality before it was even tried. What were they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, what was Angela Davis thinking at the time? I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at Angela Davis's rhetoric in the late 1960s, I mean, she's a young woman. She's extremely compelling. She has these, kind of very striking and stylish photographs with the big afro, the cool, 60s, 70s clothes. She's a very compelling public speaker. But when you dial into her rhetoric, you realize that she's actually making the same arguments that, are kind of postmodern,
that's true.
Idiot
it's
replicas.
Because you think you would say, let's try colorblindness first, and then when it doesn't give what you want, say, okay, we got to go and do affirmative action. But to start,
they wanted revolution now, though. I mean, they wanted revolution now, and for them, and you have to. The other thing that's really important, and I think it strikes to the point that you're raising, is that it's hard to remember, but this is actually 4 and 5 years after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So you had full political equality, full legal equality in 64 and 65 Voting Rights Act, and yet after that promise, after that hope, after that achievement, you have immediately radicalism take off, and that's an interesting thing. But Davis says some very interesting lines. She talks about when she's advocating for the kind of mass release of violent criminals from the prisons and jails in California. She says, well, Black Americans are 15% of the population, but 30% of the jail population, something along those lines. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something. And therefore, the disproportionate representation is a sign that the system is institutionally racist. And if you think about the simple kind of mathematics of what she's saying, it's the same logic as Ibram Kendi and all these other, kind of chuckleheads that took prominence, like what's her name, Robin DiAngelo and others that took prominence in 2020. They have nothing new to offer. Angela Davis was making the case actually much more eloquently and in a much more persuasive manner, frankly, than people who are making the same case so many years later. And so I think that you have to understand that period, and to understand the modern left. One of the key insights that I gleaned from this process is that the left has not had a new idea since 1968. Not one. The left actually hasn't had any new language since 1968, any new concepts since 1968. And in fact, we find ourselves stuck in a cycle where this treadmill of leftist ideas, they try to create euphemisms, they try to create kind of Latinate words, but it's the same core set of ideas that was fully developed by the end of the summer of 1968.
All right, so both you and Paulo Freire focus most of your energy on education. So in a sense, you could say that he is your top nemesis in the book. And you're both writers, but you're also both practical education reformers. So suppose that you had had his position in Guinea-Bissau in their education system, and you had a total free hand to do whatever he thought best. What exactly would you have done? And what are the best results you realistically think that you could have gotten if you'd been in charge of their education reform instead of him?
Well, it's a tough, it's a tough question, because I would have to be, doing the education program for a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary government. Not exactly my cup of tea.
Crazy things happen in revolutions. Sometimes some guy says, I don't know, give that guy the power.
But getting really far out and following your thought experiment to its conclusions, acknowledging some of the challenges. I mean, look, one of the biggest mistakes that he made, and was so ironic, is that when he took over the design of the education program in this country, Paulo Freire was Brazilian, so he was a Portuguese speaker. Guinea-Bissau was a Portuguese colony, so there were, at least in the large cities and the coast, there were some Portuguese speakers. But he tried to impose Portuguese as the national language, where 95% of the citizens did not speak Portuguese. And so I think that that was probably his most fatal error. And
so you would not have done that.
I would not have done that. I would have tried to figure out the various tribal languages, the various local languages. How can you actually educate people first to have basic literacy in the languages that they already speak? And only then could you have the more elite education for the middle class in Portuguese. And the other thing that I would do that Paulo Freire did not do was, he talked about the suicide of the middle class. He said the Guinea-Bissauan middle class must commit revolutionary suicide. And so the actual people who could have made a difference in building up this country, they had social capital, they had intellectual capital, they had creative capital. He sent them to the farms and told them to commit, kind of symbolic suicide. Not a great plan, actually, in a very poor country a kind of disastrously run country. The little social capital that you have, you need to tap into and actually make use of it. So, I mean, some extremely basic early errors that doomed the project from the beginning. And in hindsight, I do wonder if maybe even old Paulo would have done it differently given the chance.
All right. Now, compared to your social media, which I do read rather religiously, America's Cultural Revolution is quite coy. You mostly just describe what your key figures thought with only light critique. Is this because you think they're so obviously wrong, so that sunlight is the only disinfectant that's needed? Or to think about it another way, could you just give me a quick paragraph on Paulo Freire is wrong because?
Sure. Yes. So yeah, I'll take those two in order. I mean, there's two kinds of political books, let's say. There's political books that make an argument and political books that tell a story. For this book, I was much more interested in writing a book that tells a story. So I have these biographical sketches. I have the story of the Long March to the Institutions. I have some kind of analysis that supplements it to show how these ideas gain power. And then embedded in all of this is a critique. It's not an explicit, this person is wrong because X, Y, Z. I'm making the case for A, B, C. That book is fun. Maybe I'll write that kind of book in the future. But for this book, I wanted to use narrative techniques to make an implicit argument. And so there's a lot of logic, even on the left. You know, I had some critics that say, "Oh, well, you're making a very light, intellectual argument. You're not actually, making the argument explicit or really ramping it up to its fullest extent." And I think that it's because a lot of folks that are maybe more mathematical minded, maybe I guess they're right-brained or whichever side of the brain is supposed, if that's a real thing, I don't know, but at least symbolically, if we can look at it that way, they want a mathematical, logical, proof-like argument. But what I'm giving is something that is a more novelistic argument, a kind of creative nonfiction argument, a more using themes, characters, plot, and causality, kind of narrative causality to tell the argument. And I think that it leads the viewer to a conclusion in a much more pleasing way, in a much more sophisticated way. But if I were to say, why is Paulo Freire wrong? I would say a couple things. I would say that his view of human nature is totally at odds with the reality of human nature. I would say that he's not actually.
What sense?
In the sense that he believes that human nature is infinitely malleable, that it can be conformed to ideology, that it can be changed through the application of political power. Whereas I actually believe that human nature is fixed or near fixed, that it changes very slowly over time. And then if your politics don't conform to human nature, but seek to overwhelm human nature, they're going to have disastrous or unintended outcomes. The second thing is that I would say that Paulo Freire is wrong because despite his protestations of that he is kind of moving the world towards liberation, I actually think that he serves to move the world towards education as propaganda that actually destroys the human capacity to learn and deprioritizes rudimentary literacy skills to the point where he's actually creating like revolutionary zombies without the capacity to think for themselves, and in many cases without the capacity to even read, kind of creating illiterates that are agitated for politics, but not thoughtful thinking people that are advocating in their own interests. And then I think third, that Paulo Freire is just hideously wrong about the United States. He viewed the United States as the great enemy of equality, the great enemy of liberation, the great enemy of freedom. But all of the governments that he worked for in Latin America and Africa were dismal places that had this the rhetoric of freedom and equality, but nothing of the substance. And so I think that his political analysis was also just so off base that it makes you question his judgment in a fundamental way.
I mean, he doesn't even have the lame excuse that Marcuse had. I've never been to these countries. Who knows what's going on there? So doesn't this get to a point where you just have to think that he's evil and is not naive in the slightest? And he's just basically an Orwellian person saying freedom is slavery?
I don't think I would go there, actually. I don't think that he was evil. I think that he was deluded. I think that he remained an idealist and then transformed into a cynic over time, and then had really been, you get to this point in the political trajectories of these figures where they're so invested in their political ideology that they're willing to deny the reality around them, and that they have to cling to their ideology despite its manifest failures, because without that ideology, you sense that they would have nothing politically, emotionally, socially, spiritually. And so you get, the image is not one of evil, but it's actually one of great pathos, pity even. They're these pitiable figures that are clinging to the accolades that they're given by the institutions, when I think that in their heart of hearts, they knew that they had yielded evil in the world. But I think it's much more complex than saying simply, these are bad people pursuing bad ends and creating bad outcomes. That to me is like a Marvel movie. But life is very much not at all like a Marvel movie.
I mean, couldn't you just say that another word for idealist is fanatic? Fanatics are evil.
I think you could perhaps make an argument that idealists are fanatics, but I don't think that fanatics are evil. Look, I mean, so the American he was evil, but not necessarily because he was evil. He was a fanatic, but I don't think that those two things are mutually spring from one another. Look, the founding fathers of the United States were fanatics. I mean, they were fanatical in their beliefs. They were determined in their cause. They took massive gamble in pursuit of an idea that was implausible to most people around the world, and they succeeded and they were right. And so I'm not against fanaticism per se. I think that it's a spirit that can be channeled, it can be wielded towards good ends. It can be moderated by reason, moderated by prudence, moderated by good judgment. But I actually think that some amount of radicalism or fanaticism, shorn of its negative connotations, is actually the heart of what makes politics happen. And in fact, both good and evil is driven to a large extent by political radicals, zealots, and fanatics of all stripes.
Right. So your critics love to say that critical race theory is only a niche movement in legal academia. Now, my reply to this is that CRT is really just shorthand for left-wing brainwashing on race, gender, and beyond. So my view, the difference between, say, Derek Bell and Lawrence Tribe, it may matter a lot to far-left law professors, but in the broad scheme of things, they're basically the same. And I'd say using CRT to go and describe them both is basically like calling tissue Kleenex. Only a pedant would say it's not tissue, it's not Kleenex, it's generic tissue. All right. So what's your reaction to this?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think you're right, but I also think that the original is correct. I think that it's tissue and it's Kleenex, and in many cases, the ideas that you find in K through 12 curricula, in DEI training programs, are either explicitly or tacitly derived from critical race theory and the critical race theorists and the movement that they've created. There's just an overwhelming amount of not only academic literature, but also investigative reporting and original source document reporting that I've done, that others have done. But yes, and in a sense, does it also function as a shorthand? So when you're saying, little Timmy is going to elementary school and he's undergoing a white privilege training, is that critical race theory? I mean, yes, you could trace it back, kind of the intellectual lineage of it and make a good argument, but is it useful as a shorthand to say, yeah, that's critical race theory in practice? Yes, and I think it's both useful, there's utility to it, but it's also accurate as an intellectual manner. And so whenever they get in these linguistic debates to deny the existence of something that is obviously pervasive, I think it's a sign that they're unwilling to defend their own ideas on the merits. And that to me is just a sign to accelerate the attacks, to push forward with that line of argument, and to really just hammer them over the head with it. Because when they're in that defensive crouch, when they're trying to deny something that people see, that people feel, that people believe, you have a strategic upper hand. And actually, it's quite amazing. Even a year after we started, rallying the anti-CRT movement, we started to engage in the public debate. The critical race theorists themselves, literally the founders of the discipline, had a conference and they said, "Oh, we made a strategic mistake denying that these things were CRT. This has been CRT all along. We love CRT in K through 12 education, and now we need to defend CRT in K through 12 education." It was too late, but it was actually somewhat satisfying to hear, from the horse's mouth, that that's exactly what they were doing, and admit it in full view of the public.
I mean, on this Kleenex versus tissue, during Richard Nenyu's interview with you, he was just talking about how the idea that almost anything could be discrimination was already very well established in American law by 1970. The Supreme Court, there's even a quote, Rehnquist even quotes Orwell saying, wait a second, now you're saying that it is okay to discriminate against whites as long as it's beneficial to blacks. Just a few years ago, you were saying exactly the opposite. The plain text says exactly the opposite. It does seem like it's possible for these very expansive definitions of discrimination to have totally independent roots that have nothing to do with the legal academy, at least very little.
Yeah, certainly. And then you look at the letter of the law and the implementation of the law. And so even with the Supreme Court decision on the Harvard case, which in theory bans affirmative action or racial preferences in college admissions, we all know, anyone who's really cued into this and observing it and having spent any time in academia, they're not going to do that. They're going to find a workaround. They're going to find a euphemism. They're going to find another method of achieving the same results. And so, the left has learned how to not only manipulate the law as an offensive capacity, but also to evade the law as in the defensive capacity. And so you have a Civil Rights Act that, if you read the plain text, I believe in. I think that it is correct. I think that it is something that embodies the spirit of the Declaration and the 14th Amendment. But if you look at the implementation, bureaucratically, legally, institutionally, it's almost like you're looking at two separate things entirely. It's enough to turn you, a bit schizophrenic, having to go back and forth between these two, different personalities and two different interpretations of the same thing.
All right. So what do you think of the slogan, by any means necessary? And in particular, focusing on higher education, suppose you totally have the upper hand. You probably don't even really have totally have the upper hand at the new college. Maybe you do. You can tell us. But so would you revoke tenure for leftist professors, fire them for sharing left-wing views with students, impose affirmative action for non-leftist faculty, or what? By any means necessary. What's the answer?
Well, I mean, no, I wouldn't say by any means necessary, because there are
definitely not by any means necessary.
No, there are principles that you have to which you have to adhere. There are also, by any means necessary, really, when Eldridge Cleaver, when Eldridge Cleaver said by any means necessary, he meant at gunpoint, and certainly that's something that should be, vigorously opposed. But look, New College of Florida is a perfect example. As some of your listeners probably know, I was appointed along with a slate of conservative trustees to take over New College and to reorient the institution toward the classical liberal arts. And I think that the principles that I have and the strategies that we've employed are quite aggressive, but I think they're within the confines of good practice for universities. I think they're within the confines of respecting free speech rights, respecting the legal protections that are afforded to college faculty, for example. And I think they're in the best interest of the taxpayers of Florida, whom we are there to serve and represent. And what we've done is quite simple. We took the board majority. We're duly appointed by the people through their election of Governor DeSantis. We fired the president. We pushed out the provost. We abolished the DEI department and fired the DEI director. Over time, from what I'm told, we have kind of recomposed the admissions office with a lot of new people. We have facilitated and in some cases encouraged a process of self-selection among faculty so that some of the most hardcore, strident, ideological, left-wing activist faculty members have self-selected out of the university. They've decided that they don't want to participate in the classical liberal arts mission, that they'd rather take their goods and services elsewhere. Grateful for those decisions in many cases. And now we're hiring faculty that is aligned with the classical liberal arts mission. And you said, I think you said affirmative action for the conservative faculty, but that's a total misnomer. You can have a race, you must have actually by law, and we've actually implemented policies to require race neutral decision making at New College of Florida. You cannot discriminate against or for an individual on the basis of their race, but you can absolutely make decisions and distinctions on the basis of a shared core mission. So we're bringing in faculty members that are aligned with the classical liberal arts mission, that the university should be oriented towards the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, that they should have rigorous scholarly pursuits rather than partisan political pursuits at the center of their work at the university. And so I make no apologies about it. We are seeking those kind of faculty members. We want to provide a place for them to thrive. And we're also recomposing the student body. The student body, when we took over, was, I believe, roughly 70% female, 30% male. It was more than 50% trans, non-binary, and other queer identities. It was a ideological monoculture. It was a social justice ghetto within the Florida's public university system. It was the lowest performing university in the state. And we're trying to rebalance the student body to have kind of more or less, we're hoping to have sex parity, meaning men and women are roughly equally represented. And we want to have a wider range of student views. So it's not just a kind of left-wing monoculture. So we're bringing in students that I think will rebalance the hormones and rebalance the viewpoints on campus. And so
your goal
this is, I think, a best practice.
So your goal is not to create a right-wing monoculture. It's to do what?
Yeah, correct. It's not I mean, certainly we have to correct what has been a left-wing monoculture, but the goal is not to create a right-wing monoculture. But the goal is to create an institution where everyone shares fundamental commitments to a classical liberal arts education, to certain key principles. I'd like to see some of those principles codified as we move forward, and I'd like to see us relinquish and abolish some of the activist disciplines that are pseudo disciplines. They're not scholarly in any regard, and double down our focus on the great Western philosophical and historical and artistic traditions, to try to have a great, rich conversation on campus where we have a wide range of differing opinions, but that are all united under a shared framework of what the university should be. And that framework should be in the best interest of the public of Florida. We should not be taking taxpayer money and then advocating explicitly against the values of those taxpayers. That to me is a total betrayal of democratic principles.
All right, I got one last question for you, Chris. I've spent about a year telling your many libertarian critics to look at what you've actually said and done before criticizing you. And then you had to go and tweet, quote, "The thing I hate is libertarianism." But here's the thing, I read all your tweets, and at least 90% of the policies you push seem like steps in a libertarian direction to me. It's like colorblind meritocracy, sign me up. So call me crazy, but your professed hatred for libertarianism seems more like bad blood with a few libertarians. How wrong am I, Chris?
No, you're probably right, but maybe you can help me tease out a mystery that I've been confronted with for many months and actually now a few years. There are libertarians, and I think that they're totally wrong even on libertarian grounds, that have very vocally and very vitriolically and I think very unfairly opposed all of the work that I'm doing. And they said, Chris, someone like Governor DeSantis violates libertarian principles because he's meddling with the K-12 curriculum and he's meddling with the public universities. And my argument to them is like, wait a minute. you're saying that I mean, it's a status quo already. The state of Florida and all the states in the country set the K through 12 curriculum. The public universities are government universities. And so he has, by democratic right, when he's elected, to work with legislators to reform those institutions and making sure that they serve the values of the people that he represents, his constituents, the people of the state of Florida. And in fact, the argument of libertarians against intervention in public schools and public universities amounts to an argument that the people have no right to regulate their own government. And so it strikes me as deeply anti-libertarian. And the argument, even on its kind of the best terms, is that, well, you should advocate for eliminating public schools and eliminating public universities, and you should not meddle with them or touch them because it becomes illegitimate the second that you assert any kind of governance over the state.
And never mind, and look, you've been very good on school choice, Chris.
And not only have I been very good on school choice, but I would say that I've done more than any kind of institutional libertarian to advance school choice. I would make that argument. Guys like Corey DeAngelis, I don't count. Corey DeAngelis, I think, has done an extraordinary job at advancing school choice. I would take him out. I have a very high regard for him. But even Corey has told me, he said, Chris, the work that you did on CRT was essential for us to get universal school choice in these 6-7 states. And so I like to think that while I'm actually advancing libertarian policy proposals better than any libertarians had done in decades prior, they somehow don't appreciate the work that I've done. And so I feel like I'm an unrecognized benefactor for libertarians. But maybe, I don't know, it could be a case of professional jealousies. Libertarians, some of them seem to be quite brittle. Perhaps they see someone who is not a libertarian and actually doesn't much like libertarians in that capacity, doing a better job than they are at their actual jobs. Maybe I've exposed them as incapable, as ineffective. That's for others to decide, but certainly that's a plausible theory that may be worth speculating on.
Well, I mean, if you've got a couple more minutes, I don't know if you do, but I have actually written out my exact story for why I think libertarians.
Tell me. No, I will make a couple minutes for this.
Contribution.
Please tell me. Yeah, please tell me. Yeah.
I think most libertarian critics of yours are oblivious to two big facts. Right. First of all, thanks to hostile workplace law, we already have massive government censorship for anyone with a job. We're not starting in a world of free speech and then having Chris come along and create the first instance of censorship. We rather have an established, overwhelming censorship regime, and you're pushing back against that. And they think of the status quo as being free speech, and it's not. And
that's right.
Secondly, I think also, so thanks to government-funded education, where we have Democrat-Republican ratios of 20 or 30 to 1 in humanities and social sciences, we already have a giant system of massive state-sponsored indoctrination. And the number of libertarians who just don't seem to realize that this is going on, it's not like we have a free debate right now or anything like that. Rather, the normal thing is indoctrination with just a few dissenting voices.
That's right.
Libertarians tend to know the dissenting voices. Oh, Walter Williams, he's great. So Walter died, unfortunately, a few years ago. But like they think about Walter as like Walter and just like, is he like half? No, like it's nothing like that. It is a few dissenting voices in what is otherwise already a left-wing monoculture. So if you aren't aware of this, then Chris Rufo comes along and it seems like you are intruding upon an otherwise functioning system. But if you know what the system is already like, then it's like, no, the system's totally broken and Chris is trying to make things a little bit better. Give him a break.
That's right. And I think there's another point that is crucial that really blows apart the libertarian argument. The government has a 90% monopoly in K through 12 education and a 75% effective monopoly in higher education, colleges and universities. So even under the most stringent libertarian philosophy, in conditions of monopoly, government intervention is justified. And so the idea that you can't intervene, that the people cannot intervene in a state monopoly and at least try to simultaneously break up the state monopoly, promote school choice, and create more educational freedom and choice, but actually regulate the monopoly that, look, it exists. It's the status quo. It's going to be the status quo for the near future. To say, for example, that you can't teach that certain members of a racial category are inherently evil to kindergartners. That's the first divisive concept, right? That strikes me as eminently prudent to say, you know what, we're going to restrict racial scapegoating, the government implementing racial scapegoating against children. You know, that strikes me as not a big government overreach, but as a prudent restriction on a system that I agree is not ideal. I don't want a government monopoly on education, but I deal with the practical reality as it exists. The presuppositions that I make my arguments from are not from an abstract, idealistic, and an abstract notion of how society should be. And if my libertarian friends would first acknowledge the status quo and then come up with policies based on the actual underlying reality, I think they would be much more sympathetic to my point of view.
I did this Twitter poll where I said, imagine that every university in America had an Institute for Creation Research funded by taxpayers promoting creationism. And then I said, so would defunding it be required by intellectual freedom, forbidden by intellectual freedom, allowed, what? And the answers were all over the place. And I was just scratching my head and saying, I guess that people think that having states, like an official state-sanctioned church is actually part of freedom, maybe. When you're like, wow, that's such a weird view of things. And yet it is one where there's something about the status quo where it's like, well, this is the status quo is freedom, and then any deviation from that is unfreedom. It's like, no, it's crazy.
Yeah. Amen, man. I totally agree with you, and I really appreciate you for making that point. Please scream it from the rooftops.
All right.
And get other libertarians on board.
Any last thoughts? Anything I didn't touch on?
No, I appreciate it, and it's great to connect, and you know, keep up all the good work that you're doing, and keep shaking it up. And it's been fun to chat.
All right, so great talking to you, Chris. And whatever you say about libertarians, I like you. Thanks a lot for being here.
All right, see ya.
All right.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.